It was an old, dusty box I found while cleaning out my grandmother's attic. Among the old, forgotten trinkets and family heirlooms, the box sat alone in the corner, hidden beneath yellowed newspapers. The moment I picked it up, I felt a strange chill, like the air had suddenly thickened around me. It was heart-shaped, wrapped in faded ribbon, and the wood creaked beneath my fingertips. Something about it felt wrong, like it had been waiting for me. Inside, nestled beneath the crumbling tissue paper, I found an envelope, old, yellowing, and sealed with a crimson wax that had long since lost its sheen. My name was written on the front, but in handwriting I didn't recognize. I peeled open the envelope, feeling the weight of the moment press down on me. What I read next chilled me to my core. To my dearest Daniel, our love transcends time, my heart. Though years have passed, I have not forgotten you. February 14th is a day that binds us. Do not ignore the date. Remember me, for I shall never leave you. I read it over and over. The words imprinted in my mind. My stomach twisted. I had no idea who could have written it, but there was something eerily familiar about it. The handwriting, strangely like my own, sent shivers down my spine. I must have brushed it off as some kind of mistake, something left behind by my grandmother, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like a warning. I tore the letter into pieces, not wanting to deal with whatever it meant, and tossed it into the fireplace. As the flames devoured the paper, I let out a nervous laugh. Ridiculous, right? It was nothing, just a silly old letter. But as the letter burned, something strange happened. My phone buzzed, and I pulled it out, glancing at the screen. Unknown number. Hello? I answered. A soft, distorted voice whispered through the speaker. Burning my love won't erase me. See you soon. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The voice sounded faint, like it was coming from miles away, but it was unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, but I didn't recognize it. I looked at my phone. The message had vanished. No record. No trace. The room seemed to close in on me. I shook my head, trying to shake the feeling. It was nothing. It had to be. But over the next few days, the odd occurrences, I couldn't escape them. I woke up one morning to find my reflection in the bathroom mirror, lingering just a little too long. I blinked, and for a moment, it wasn't me staring back. It was someone else. Someone familiar but distorted. The image faded before I could figure it out. Then I started hearing things. Soft whispers in the dark corners of my apartment. The faint sound of a woman laughing, but when I turned to look, no one was there. The hairs on the back of my neck would stand on end and my heart would race, but I brushed it off. There had to be a rational explanation, right? A neighbor playing pranks maybe, or my tired mind playing tricks. But when my phone buzzed again, I knew I was in deep. The unknown number appeared again. Remember me, Daniel? It asked. The voice was clearer this time, colder. You can't forget me. That was the moment I couldn't ignore it any. I didn't know who this person was or why they seemed to know me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Then, February 14th came. I woke up to a note slid under my door. It was written in the same handwriting as the letter, the one that haunted my thoughts since that day I found it in the attic. You forgot our anniversary? I didn't. Tonight, at midnight, I'm waiting. I stared at the note for what felt like an eternity. A pit formed in my stomach. I wanted to throw it away, forget it, but something inside me, some voice in my head, told me that I couldn't. It felt like a challenge, like the clock was ticking towards something I couldn't escape. That night, I sat in my apartment, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at me. I didn't want to be alone, but no one else could understand. It wasn't like I could tell anyone about the strange things that had been happening, about the voice on the phone, about the letter. They'd think I was losing it. At midnight, I heard the creak of my door opening slowly. My heart stopped. My apartment was empty. No one was supposed to be here. I jumped up and rushed to the living room. There, sitting in the middle of the floor, was a dinner table set for two. The candles on the table flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. The table was set perfectly, steaming hot food on porcelain plates, the scent of roses filling the air. But something was wrong. The roses smelled like rot. My phone buzzed again, and this time, the screen was cracked. The message was simple. You've kept me waiting too long. I didn't know what was happening. I felt the room grow colder, the air thick with something I couldn't place. The whispering returned, now louder and more urgent. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. I turned quickly, trying to find an escape, but when I looked back at the table, something had changed. The empty chair across from me was now filled. A woman sat there, her face pale and distorted, her eyes hollow. She was wearing an old, tattered dress, and in her hands, she held the letter I had burned. Before I could react, the room shuddered, the temperature dropping to freezing. The lights flickered and went out. My breath came out in visible puffs as I scrambled to my feet, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The woman, Lillian, smiled at me, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. You remember me, don't you? She whispered, her voice a raspy breath in the darkness. I froze, unable to move, unable to speak. The memories came crashing down, memories of a life that wasn't mine. Lillian, my lover, my victim. She had died on Valentine's night years ago because of me. I had broken her heart, shattered her soul, and now she had come back from to claim what was hers. Suddenly, everything went black. I woke up somewhere else. A room dimly lit by candles. The air smelled like roses, but this time, it didn't smell rotten. It smelled alive. I stood in front of an old mirror. My reflection wasn't mine. I saw myself, but it wasn't the face I knew. I looked different, older, like someone from the past. And there she was, standing in front of me, smiling softly. Happy Valentine. I tried to speak, but no words came. My hands were frozen at my sides. I couldn't move. The world around me had shifted. The calendar in the corner read February 14th, 1923. Lillian took my hand, pulling me close. Her touch was cold, but I could feel the weight of eternity. You didn't forget my. I'm never going. Outside, the door slammed shut with a finality that sent a chill down. The attic door locked from the outside, and I was trapped forever. Happy Valentine's Day. The old carnival hadn't been open in years. I remember walking past it every Valentine's Day, always with a sense of dread, the abandoned rides standing like rusted skeletons against the dark sky. There was a strange sort of beauty in its decay, but it wasn't the kind that made you feel comfortable. It was the kind that made you feel like something dark was lurking just out of sight, waiting for you to come closer. This year, for reasons I can't quite explain, I decided to go in. I'd been visiting my grandmother in the city for the weekend, and she told me about the carnival's tragic history. It had been a place of joy and laughter once, she said, but that was before the fire, before the children disappeared. She warned me to stay away, but my curiosity got the better of me. It was Valentine's Day, after all, a night for love and joy, right? I sneaked through a hole in the rusted fence, the metal scraping against the cold air as I stepped through. The carnival grounds were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of laughter and music replaced by the soft whisper of the wind rustling through the skeletal remains of rides. The Ferris wheel, once towering and majestic, now stood frozen in place, the seats swaying slightly in the breeze. The air smelled faintly of burnt wood and something sweet but sickly sweet, like roses that had rotted in the sun. As I walked deeper into the grounds, I could almost hear the laughter of children in the distance, soft and distant, but still unmistakable. I glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out at me, but no one did. The place was empty, or so I thought. I wandered toward the main tent, the once vibrant stripes now faded and torn. As I stepped inside, the air grew thicker, the temperature dropping by several degrees. My breath fogged in front of me, and I shivered. The interior of the tent was filled with shadows, but I could see shapes moving within them, their forms distorted and twisted. I wasn't alone. A soft giggle echoed in the darkness, and I froze. I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding. At the center of the tent stood an old carousel, its horses eerily still, but there was one that caught my eye, one that was different. It was a black stallion, its eyes glowing faintly red in the dim light, and it was looking straight at me. Suddenly, the air shifted, and the whispers grew louder. My pulse raced as I backed away, trying to retreat, but my feet seemed to be glued to the floor. The shadows around me began to twist and stretch, forming shapes that I couldn't quite understand, distorted faces, and then I saw them, the children. They were standing just outside the circle of light, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. They were waiting for something, waiting for me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I could feel my legs trembling as I turned toward the exit, but it was too late. The shadows closed in around me, thickening, suffocating. The children stepped forward, their hands reaching out, their smiles twisted and wrong. One of them, a girl with long, tangled hair, stepped forward and whispered, "You should have stayed away." I tried to run, but the tent spun around me, the walls closing in. I couldn't escape. I couldn't breathe. Suddenly, I was pulled to the ground, and I felt something cold and wet on my skin. It was the carousel horse, the black stallion, its jaw hanging open in a grotesque grin, and its cold breath was on my neck. My heart raced as it lowered its head, the sound of its hooves echoing in the air, but it wasn't moving. It was waiting for me. Before I could comprehend what was happening, the world went black. When I woke up, I was lying in the middle of the carnival, alone. The tent was gone, the rides were all still and silent. The wind blew through the empty space, carrying the smell of burnt wood and roses. The children were gone, but something was different. I could feel their eyes on me, hidden in the shadows. I could feel them watching, waiting for me to make a mistake, to give them what they wanted. I had become part of their story, part of the carnival's twisted history. And I knew deep down that I'd never leave. Not really. Valentine's Day had become something darker, something I couldn't escape. The carnival's curse wasn't just for the children. It was for anyone foolish enough to walk through its gates. A love that never dies. A love that never lets you go. It was a cold February night, the kind of night where the air feels thick and heavy, and every breath you take seems to freeze in your chest. The streets were empty except for the occasional flicker of a streetlight casting eerie shadows across the sidewalks. I had been driving home from work when I noticed the small, old diner at the edge of town. It had been closed for as long as I could remember, the neon sign above the door long since broken. But tonight, the lights were on. Curiosity got the better of me. I had no reason to stop, but something about the place felt off, like it was calling to me. I parked my car outside and stepped into the diner, the door creaking as I pushed it open. The familiar smell of greasy food mixed with something else, something sweet, almost sickly. The diner was dimly lit, but there was a warmth to it, the kind of warmth you feel in a place that's been around for far too long. The counter was empty, but the jukebox in the corner was playing a slow, haunting tune. I sat down at the counter, glancing around the room. The place was old, much older than remembered. The floor was cracked, the wallpaper peeling in some spots, but the tables and chairs were oddly pristine, as if someone had been taking care of it. The waitress came up to me, her steps almost silent. She was older, her face drawn and pale, but her eyes, they were what caught me. They were dark, too dark, and they didn't blink. There was something unsettling about them, but I smiled and ordered a coffee. "You must be new to town," she said, her voice low and hushed, almost like a whisper. "I don't recognize. I've lived here my whole life," I confused. "I've just never noticed the diner before." She smiled, but there was something cold in it, something that made my stomach twist. "You've noticed now. That's all that matters." She poured the coffee in front of me, and I couldn't help but notice the strange way she handled the cup. It was as if she was almost afraid to touch it, her fingers trembling slightly as she set it down. "It's always open on Valentine's Day," she added, her eyes never leaving mine. "For people like you." I froze, feeling a chill run down my spine. "People like me?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked away, her steps oddly light for someone who seemed so frail. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The diner had an eerie vibe, and I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't say by who or what. I sipped the coffee, hoping it would calm my nerves, but the taste was strange. It wasn't bad, just different, almost too sweet. It coated my mouth, and I swallowed, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. Then, as I looked up from my cup, I saw them. The people sitting at the back booth, their faces obscured by shadows, but their eyes visible. They were staring at me with the same dark, unblinking gaze. My heart skipped a beat. There was something off about it. They weren't real. My pulse quickened as the waitress returned, standing beside me now. She was smiling again, but her teeth seemed sharper, more predatory. She leaned in close, and I could smell the faint scent of roses mixed with something else, something rotten. "You should leave now," she whispered, her breath cold against my ear. "But you won't. No one ever does." I stood up, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the diner had changed. The walls were closing in, the air growing thicker. The jukebox was playing faster now, its tune distorted, like it was mocking me. My heart raced. I backed toward the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pulled. The people in the back booth had started to move, their faces emerging from the shadows. They were no longer human. Their skin was gray and cracked, their eyes hollow and lifeless. Their lips curled into grotesque smiles as they began to stand, their limbs jerking unnaturally like marionettes. "You're too late," the waitress said softly, almost lovingly. "The diner only opens for those who need it, and tonight it needs you." I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the growing hum of the jukebox. The walls were closing in, and the air was so thick I couldn't breathe. I turned back to the door, pounding on it with all my strength, but it was useless. The diner wasn't just a building anymore. It was a trap, and I was its next victim. The people were getting closer now, their hands reaching out for me, their fingers cold and stiff. I could feel their eyes on me, pulling me into the darkness. I stumbled back, falling to the floor, my chest heaving with panic. The waitress knelt beside me, her hand brushing against my cheek. "Happy Valentine's Day," she whispered, her voice sweet and sickly. "Now, you'll never leave." I could feel myself slipping away, my mind fading as the world around me twisted and turned. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the door that wouldn't open no matter how hard I tried. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the diner, cold and alone. The jukebox had stopped. The room was silent. The door was open. But the moment I stepped outside, I realized something was wrong. The town had changed. The streets were empty, the houses boarded up. The world I knew was gone. and in the distance I could see the diner, still open, still waiting, like it had always been, and I knew deep down that I would never leave. I was never the type to believe in love at first sight, but then I met Claire. It was the week leading up to Valentine's Day, and I had just moved into a new apartment in a small town that seemed to be stuck in time. The streets were quiet, the houses a little too close together, and the air always seemed to smell faintly of something old, like dust or forgotten memory. I first saw Claire while I was walking home from the store. She was standing at the end of the street, looking down at the ground as if waiting for something. She had long brown hair that cascaded down her back in waves, and her eyes were a piercing blue, almost unnatural. There was an aura about her, something that made me feel drawn to her, like I couldn't look away. "Hey," I said hesitantly, my voice catching in my throat as I approached. She looked up at me, and the moment our eyes met, I felt an inexplicable connection, as if we were meant to be. Her smile was warm, but it was tinged with something I couldn't place, something dark, something haunting. "You just moved here, didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft but confident. "Yeah, just a few days ago," I replied, trying to hide the nervousness creeping into my chest. "I'm still getting used to everything around here." "You'll get used to it," she said, stepping a little closer. "Everyone does. I'll show you around if you—" I didn't think twice. Something in the way she spoke made me feel like I had known her forever, like we were already connected. I agreed without hesitation, and she smiled again. This time, her smile seemed a little too wide, a little too knowing. Over the next few days, Claire and I spent more time together. She showed me the old parts of town, the abandoned buildings, the quiet parks. Every time we walked together, I felt more and more drawn to her. She seemed to know everything about me, even things I hadn't told her. The way she looked at me made me feel like she could see through me, like she knew my every thought and desire. But there was always something off about her. It wasn't just the way she looked at me. It was the way she talked, the way she never seemed to sleep, the way her presence seemed to consume everything around her. I began to notice small things, the way people in the town would cross the street when they saw her, the way they looked at her with fear in their eyes, the way no one ever mentioned her family, her past, or where she lived. But despite all that, I couldn't stay away from her. Valentine's Day arrived, and Claire insisted we meet at the old, rundown mansion on the outskirts of town. It was a place I had heard rumors about but never dared to visit. The locals whispered about it, said it was cursed. Some said it was haunted by the spirits of those who had disappeared over the years. But Claire seemed so excited, her eyes glinting with anticipation, and I couldn't bring myself to refuse. "I have something to show you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's our secret." The mansion was exactly as I had imagined, dark, decaying, and utterly abandoned. The air inside was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under our weight as we stepped inside. Claire led me through the hallways, her footsteps soundless. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine, but I pushed the feeling aside. Claire was with me, and that was all that mattered. We stopped in front of a large, ornate door at the back of the mansion. It was covered in strange markings, symbols I didn't recognize. Claire reached out and pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with old furniture and scattered belongings. "This is where it all began," Claire whispered. "This is where we'll always be together." I stepped into the room, my heart racing with a mix of excitement and fear. But then, something strange happened. The air grew cold, and I noticed a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a woman, pale and lifeless, her eyes wide open but unseeing. Her body was twisted, contorted, in ways that no human body should be able to move. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. Who is that?" Claire smiled, her expression cold and distant. She was the last one. She couldn't handle it. "Handle what?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "The curse," she said, her voice no longer soft but sharp, full of malice. "The curse that binds us together, the one that makes us never leave." I didn't understand what she meant at first, but then it hit me. The town, the mansion, the strange people who avoided her. They weren't afraid of her. They were afraid of what she was, of what I had become. As Claire stepped closer, I realized with horror that the markings on the door weren't just symbols. They were sacrifices. Every person who had ever crossed Claire's path had disappeared, and I was about to be the next one. My mind raced, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in this twisted reality she had created. She reached out to touch my cheek, and I could feel the chill of her fingers seep into my skin, the coldness creeping through my veins. "Happy Valentine's Day. Now you're mine forever." I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the air thick and suffocating. I could feel my body weakening, my mind slipping into a fog. I could feel myself becoming part of her twisted world. And as the darkness took over, I realized too late. Claire had never been here. She was something far worse. a creature bound to the mansion, to the town, to the curse that would never let her go. And now, neither would I. I was just a kid when it happened, but I remember that night like it was yesterday, Valentine's Day. I had always loved the holiday as a child, candy hearts, chocolates, and the excitement of picking out the perfect card for my parents. But that year, things were different. My mom was acting strange, her eyes wide and distant, her hands trembling as she handed me my Valentine's Day card. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Stay inside tonight, no matter what." I didn't understand what she meant. It was a cold winter evening, the kind that made the air feel crisp, the sky a blanket of dark blue with a scattering of stars. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Everything seemed normal, yet something felt off, like there was an invisible weight in the air, pressing down on the house. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath. "You'll understand tomorrow," my mom said, her voice barely audible. That night after dinner, I went to bed as usual, but I couldn't. I kept hearing things, faint noises outside my window. The wind howled, but every now and then I could swear I heard something else. A whisper, a rustling, like footsteps in the snow. I pulled the covers tighter around me, trying to ignore it. It was probably just my imagination, but the noises grew louder. I couldn't stay in bed anymore. I crept to my window and peered outside into the darkness. The snow was falling heavily, covering the ground in a thick white blanket. But in the distance, at the edge of the trees, I saw something moving, a shadow. It was too large to be a person, but too humanoid to be anything else. A figure, tall and hunched, its body shifting and twisting in unnatural ways. It was moving slowly, deliberately, its feet crunching in the snow as it drew closer to our house. My heart raced, and I stumbled back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was coming closer, closer to the house, its shape growing clearer in the glow of the streetlight outside. It was a man, but not quite. His limbs were elongated, his face obscured by a hood, but could feel his eyes. His eyes were on me. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the front door, making me jump in a fright. I froze, my breath shallow. My mom had told me to stay inside, but I wasn't sure what to do. Should I hide? Should I call her? Another knock, and then the door rattled, as though something or someone was trying to force it open. I heard my mom's voice from down the hall, but it sounded different, almost as if it wasn't her at all. "Don't answer the door," she called softly. "Don't answer it." I grabbed the phone, my hands shaking. But before I could dial, the door creaked open on its own. The figure was standing in the doorway. He was taller than any man I had ever seen, and his face was still hidden beneath his hood. The dim light from the hallway revealed twisted shadows across his body, like his shape was constantly shifting. "Hello, little one," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "I've come for you." I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. Something in my gut told me that this wasn't just some stranger. This thing, this creature, was not human. The man's head tilted, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "I've been waiting for a long time," his voice cold and distant. "You don't know it, but you've been chosen." I didn't wait to hear. I ran, as fast as my legs could carry me, down the hall and into my mom's room. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. My mom was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. She didn't even look at me when I rushed in, my breath ragged, my eyes wide with fear. "He's here! The man from outside. He's at the door." My mom's eyes flickered, a look of recognition flashing across her face. "No," she said quietly. "He shouldn't be here. He promised he wouldn't come back. But it's too late now." I was so confused. "What do you mean? Who is he? Why is he here?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood up and walked over to the window. I watched her carefully. She slid the curtains open just a crack. She stared out into the snow-covered yard, her face pale and strained. "There's something you need to know," she said slowly, as if the words were tearing her apart. "Every year on Valentine's Day, he comes for it's a pact, a deal that your father and I made when we thought we could escape it. We thought we could hide, but we were wrong. I didn't understand. A pact? With who? What are you talking about?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with regret. "With him, the Valentine's Day man. He's a creature, a spirit, who comes for one soul every year on this night. He feeds on love, on the purity of the heart. We tried to escape, but we couldn't. He's been watching us, waiting for the right time, and tonight it's your turn." I felt a coldness spread through my chest. "My turn," I repeated, my voice barely awake. She nodded. "I'm sorry. I never wanted you to be part of this. But now," she trailed off, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You have to go. You have to run." Before I could protest, the door burst open. The Valentine's Day man was standing in the doorway, his hood now pulled back to reveal his face. But it wasn't a face at all. It was nothing. A dark void, empty and endless. He reached for me, his hand cold as ice, and just as I thought he would grab me, the room plunged into darkness. The last thing I heard was my mother's voice, faint but desperate, calling my name. When I woke up, I was outside in the snow, the cold biting at my skin. The house was gone. The Valentine's Day man was gone. And my mother? She was gone too. All that was left was the silence and the faint scent of roses. I was never one for superstition, but that all changed the night I decided to spend Valentine's Day alone in the old cabin on the outskirts of town. It was a place I had rented for a weekend getaway, a quiet retreat to escape the stress of daily life. The cabin, secluded in the woods, seemed like the perfect place to relax. No distractions, just peace and quiet. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't the creaky floors or the dust that made the air thick with the scent of abandonment. It wasn't even the way the fireplace seemed to have an unnatural draft, the smoke swirling in strange patterns. It was the mirrors. There were mirrors everywhere, in the hallway, in the living room, even in the bathroom. Tall, old-fashioned mirrors that seemed out of place in a rustic cabin. I tried to ignore them, but as I unpacked my things, I couldn't help but notice that their reflections were off. They didn't reflect things the way they should. The images were too dark, too distorted. Every time I glanced at one, I could swear I saw a figure standing just behind me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just tired. But as the evening drew closer, the unease only grew. It was Valentine's Day after all, a day that was supposed to be filled with love and joy. I had been looking forward to the peace and solitude, but now it felt like something was watching me, something waiting for the right moment to strike. Around 9 p.m., I decided to make some tea and settle in by the fire. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. As I sipped my tea, I noticed the mirrors in the room seemed to shimmer in the firelight, their reflections rippling like water. My skin prickled. I turned my attention away, trying to focus on the warmth of the fire. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned sharply, but nothing was there. Just the empty, flickering reflection of the room in the mirror. That's when I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and for the first time, I wondered if I had made a mistake coming here alone. I walked cautiously toward the hallway, my mind racing. The mirrors lining the walls seemed to shimmer, their surfaces rippling like disturbed water. I reached the first mirror, and as I looked into it, I saw me, but not the me I recognized. The reflection in the glass wasn't smiling, wasn't calm. It was twisted, distorted, the face contorted in an expression of pure terror. Before I could react, the reflection in the mirror smiled, a cold, cruel smile that wasn't mine. I stepped back in shock, but the reflection didn't move. It just stared at me, its eyes empty and hollow. It was as though the mirror had become a portal, showing me a different version of myself, one that had been twisted by something dark, something. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. And then I heard it again, the footsteps, louder this, closer. I turned around, but there was no one there. The air around me felt suffocating, closing in, and I could almost feel a presence, something unseen but unmistakable. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I felt drawn to the next mirror, my body moving of its own accord. I didn't want to look, but something inside me urged me to do so. When I looked into the mirror, my reflection was different again. This time, it was no longer alone. There, standing behind me, was a figure, a tall, dark shape with glowing red eyes. It was a man, but not a man. His features were blurred, distorted, like he was a shadow of something else, something older, something evil. I froze. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The figure in the mirror reached out, its hand stretching toward me, its fingers too long, too twisted. I could feel its coldness through the glass, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't just a reflection. It was real. The mirror was a gateway, and the figure on the other side was trying to break through. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the wooden floor as I bolted toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the cabin itself was trapping me inside. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The figure in the mirror wasn't just a reflection in it. It was moving, stepping out of the glass, its presence growing stronger by the second. I turned and ran toward the back of the cabin, desperate to find an escape. But every mirror I passed showed the figure, closer each time. Its red eyes followed me, its twisted smile growing wider. I could hear its breath now, cold and ragged, like it was right behind me. I finally reached the back door and shoved it open, but the cold night air was worse than I imagined. The forest outside was dark, the trees pressing in around me like they were alive. I could hear the sound of branches snapping, the wind howling through the woods, but there was something else. The footsteps. They were right behind me. I didn't stop running. I didn't dare to look back. But as I fled through the woods, the feeling of being hunted, of being chased by something that should not exist, consumed me. It was only when I reached the main road and saw a car in the distance that I allowed myself to stop, my body shaking uncontrollably. I flagged the car down, and the driver, a stranger, looked at me with confusion. "You okay?" he asked, but I couldn't answer. I couldn't explain what had happened. The cabin, the mirrors, the thing that had been chasing me, it was all too much. The driver gave me a strange look but let me in. I don't know why, but I could feel that the thing was still following me, that it was still out there in the woods, waiting for me to return. And as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped at all. Every mirror I pass now, I see it, the figure, its eyes glowing red, its smile twisted and cruel, and I know that it's still watching, waiting for the right moment to claim me, and I fear that someday I won't be able to outrun it again. It was supposed to be the perfect Valentine's Day, the kind of night where everything felt right, where everything was lined up just the way I wanted. I'd been dating Liam for over a year, and we had planned an intimate, romantic evening in an old, cozy bed and breakfast just outside of town, the kind of place you would see in a magazine, warm, charming, and isolated from the world. The trip was meant to be a break from everything, the hectic pace of life, the stress, and the noise. It was just going to be the two of us, a quiet dinner, and a night by the fire. But from the moment we arrived at the bed and breakfast, things felt off. The place was beautiful, no doubt. The owner, a woman named Evelyn, greeted us with a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She seemed pleasant enough, but there was an odd air about her. Her hands were shaking slightly when she handed us the key, and her gaze lingered on us for a moment longer than it should have. "Dinner will be served at 7, she said with a strange smile. "Please make yourselves comfortable. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." We nodded politely, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The room we were assigned was charming, but again, there was an uncomfortable vibe. The bed was large, with dark velvet curtains that covered the windows, and there was an old-fashioned mirror on the wall. But there was something about the mirror that bothered me. Its reflection didn't look quite right. I brushed it off, trying to push away the feeling of unease. After all, it was just nerves. I had been looking forward to this getaway for so long, and I didn't want to let anything ruin it. Liam, ever the optimist, was already unpacking and talking about our plans for the. We spent the next hour walking around the property, admiring the view of the dense woods surrounding the house. But no matter how hard I tried to enjoy the scenery, the feeling of being watched lingered in the air. It was as if the trees themselves were staring at, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled hands. At dinner, Evelyn served us a delicious meal, but the whole time, I felt an overwhelming sense of being trapped. The house was so quiet, except for the soft crackling of the fire in the dining room. The only other sound was the occasional clink of silverware as we ate in near silence. When it was time to return to our room, Evelyn was nowhere to be found. The house felt colder now, emptier. The warm glow of the fireplace had been replaced by the oppressive stillness of the night. Liam suggested we go to bed early, so we did. But as soon as I lay down, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't the normal excitement or nerves. It was something deeper, something primal. The sensation of being watched had returned, more intense now, and it was as if the walls were closing in around me. I tried to focus on Liam, his steady breathing beside me, but I couldn't shake the feeling then alone. Suddenly I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like nails running. It was faint, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart racing. Liam stirred beside me. He didn't wake up. I slowly turned my head toward the sound, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. At first, I saw nothing, but then, in the reflection of the mirror across the room, I saw it. A figure standing at the foot of the bed. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to speak, but no words came. The figure in the mirror was not. It wasn't human either. It was tall, thin, with long, twisted arms that reached down toward the floor, fingers ending in sharp claws. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see its eyes, wide, hollow, and staring directly at me. I gasped, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. "Liam," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Wake up!" But he didn't stir. The figure in the mirror seemed to grow larger, its features more pronounced. I could feel its presence closing in on me, and I could see it now, its mouth, gaping open, filled with jagged teeth. I wanted to scream, but the air around me felt thick, suffocating. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. It was like the figure was pulling me in inch by inch. I tried to wake Liam again, but this time, he finally opened his eyes. He looked at me, confused at first. Then his gaze followed mine to the mirror. His expression changed in an instant. His face drained of color as he stared at the reflection, his eyes wide with terror. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Before I could answer, the figure in the mirror smiled. It wasn't a smile of amusement, but one of hunger. the kind of smile that made your stomach twist in fear. And then it moved. It didn't just step out of the mirror. It ripped itself free, its body bending and twisting in ways that should have been impossible. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the unnatural silence. The figure, now fully standing in the room, began to move toward us, its fingers stretched out, as if it were reaching for or someone. Liam pulled me toward the door, but it was locked. The coldness in the room grew unbearable, and I could see my breath in the air. The figure was getting closer, its form flickering in and out, like a glitching video. Desperately, Liam grabbed the lamp from the nightstand and threw it at the figure, but it passed right through it, as though the figure wasn't even solid. It was coming for it. We had no escape. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. Its eyes locked onto Liam, and for a moment I thought it would attack. But instead, it whispered in a voice that sounded like the scraping of nails on glass. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that I could see the condensation of our breath in the air. The figure reached for us, but as its fingers brushed against the air, the room seemed to shudder, and then, just as quickly, it vanished. Liam and I stood there, frozen in terror, waiting for the next move. But nothing came. The room was still. The figure was gone. We were left in the eerie silence, hearts racing, unsure of what had just happened. The rest of the night passed in a daze. Neither of us slept. We didn't dare close our eyes, afraid the figure might return. The next morning, we left as soon as the sun rose, never looking back at the bed and breakfast. We couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind, something dark, something we could never escape. We never spoke of it again. But sometimes, late at night, I catch a glimpse of something in the reflection of a mirror, something that doesn't belong. And I remember, it wasn't just a nightmare. It wasn't. Valentine's Day was always a special day for me and my best friend Sarah. We had been inseparable since childhood, and every year we'd make a point to spend the day together no matter what. This year, Sarah had insisted on doing something a little different. Instead of the usual dinner or movie date, she wanted us to visit an old, abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. "It's the perfect place for an adventure," she'd said with a mischievous smile, her eyes sparkling with excitement. I hesitated at first. The mansion was notorious in town. People said it was haunted, that strange things happened there. But Sarah's infectious energy made it hard to say no, and I figured we could go in, take some photos, and leave before it got too dark. After all, we were just two curious friends, right? We arrived at the mansion around sunset, the sky painted with streaks of purple and orange as the last rays of daylight flickered out. The mansion loomed ahead, a dilapidated structure with ivy-covered walls and shattered windows. The front door creaked as we pushed it open, the sound echoing in the still air. My heart beat faster as we stepped inside, the temperature dropping noticeably across the threshold. It smelled of mildew and decay, the floors covered in dust and cobwebs. As we walked deeper into the mansion, the eerie silence pressed in on us. The place felt alive, in an unsettling, like it was watching us, waiting for something. "Let's explore upstairs," Sarah suggested, her voice breaking the silence. "The attic has always intrigued me. They say that's where the real mystery." I wasn't so sure, but I followed her up the creaky staircase. The boards groaned under our weight as we made our way to the second floor. The long, dimly lit hallway was lined with portraits of people I couldn't place, their eyes seeming to follow us with an unsettling intensity. We reached the door to the attic, and Sarah pushed it open with a soft creak. The air inside was thick and musty, and the space was cluttered with old furniture and forgotten relics. A large, dusty mirror hung on the wall across from us, its surface cracked and streaked with age. "Take a look at this," Sarah said, her voice low as she moved toward the mirror. She reached out to touch it, but something in my gut told me not to. Maybe we should leave, but Sarah didn't hear me. She was too absorbed in the reflection, her fingers grazing the glass. Then it happened. The mirror began to shimmer, its surface rippling like water. My heart slammed against my chest, and I took a step back, my feet frozen to the floor. The reflection of Sarah in the mirror suddenly shifted. It wasn't her anymore. In the mirror, Sarah's face twisted into a grotesque, distorted version of itself. Her eyes were wide and hollow, her mouth stretched into an eerie smile that didn't belong. But it wasn't just her reflection that was changing. It was as if the entire room in the mirror was different. The walls, the attic floor, all of it was transformed into something darker, colder. A shadowy figure loomed behind the distorted Sarah, its form barely visible but unmistakable in the shifting glass. "Sarah!" I screamed, my voice shaking, but she didn't respond. She was still staring into the mirror, transfixed, a strange expression on her face. "Sarah, get away from it!" I cried, my feet finally moving as I rushed toward her. But the moment I touched her arm, she flinched violently, her body jerking away from me as if she had been struck. "What's wrong with you?" she snapped, her voice sharp and unrecognizable. Her eyes were wide, and I could see a strange flicker of something far removed from the Sarah I knew. She stepped away from the mirror, and I followed, but the damage had already been done. As soon as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. The temperature dropped even further, and a heavy, suffocating presence seemed to settle in the room. "We need to get out," I whispered urgently, my voice trembling with fear. But Sarah wasn't listening. She was still staring at the mirror, her expression vacant, like she was in some kind of trance. "Sarah, stop it!" I shouted, shaking her shoulders. She finally blinked, her eyes clearing for a moment, but the moment was fleeting. She turned slowly back toward the mirror. I'm sorry," she murmured, almost to herself. "It's too late now. It's already taken me." My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. Whatever was in that, it wasn't just a reflection. It had somehow reached through, and it had claimed her. "No," I said, shaking my head in disbelief. "You're not yourself, Sarah. We can fix this. We can get out." But her body seemed to reject my words, her movements jerky and unnatural. She turned to face me, her expression now twisted, that grotesque smile stretched unnaturally wide. She reached toward me, her fingers cold as ice. Before I could react, the room went dark. The air thickened, suffocating me. I could hear whispers, soft and insistent, like they were coming from all around us, from the walls themselves. The shadowy figure in the mirror grew stronger, its form becoming more defined, more tangible. "Sarah!" I screamed, but she was no longer the friend I had known. She was something else, something unrecognizable, trapped between this world and the one behind the mirror. I turned and ran, slamming into the door in a frantic attempt to break free, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in around me, the whispers growing louder, the air growing colder. I could feel it now. It was behind me. It was no longer just in the mirror. It had crossed over. With all my strength, I threw myself at the door once more, and this time, it gave way. I tumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, but when I looked back, I saw her, the figure, standing in the doorway. Her face was twisted, her eyes empty, her mouth stretching into that awful smile as she reached out to me. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice no longer Sarah's. "You belong here." I ran, heart pounding, my body moving on instinct. I didn't look back as I made my way down the stairs, through the darkened halls, and out into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my car. I drove off, not once looking in the rearview mirror, afraid of what I might see. It's been months since that night, but I can't escape the image of Sarah's twisted face in the mirror. Every time I pass a reflective surface, I feel her eyes on me, her cold fingers brushing the back of my neck, and every Valentine, I hear the whispering voice in my ear, begging me to return. "You belong here."